But like right here, it opens by saying our political class does not govern, it entertains. It plays its assigned role in our fictitious democracy, howling with outrage to constituents and selling them out. The Squad and the Progressive Caucus have no more intention of fighting for universal health care, workers' rights, or defying the war machine than the Freedom Caucus fights for freedom. Chris, why is that?
Because they don't have any power. They're just window dressing. We've undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. All of the levers of power have been seized by corporate forces and their lobbyists. The courts have been deformed to serve their interests. The media is largely, almost completely controlled by roughly a half dozen corporations, certainly the airwaves. And it's burlesque. It's vaudeville. It's entertainment. It doesn't. The actual centers of power, which are real, are completely hidden.
So, so what do you say? What we just saw last week, that actually the Squad does have power because the right wingers, led by Matt Gaetz in the House, use their leverage to extract concessions for their vote for Speaker. Now, we tried to get the Squad to do the exact same thing, or the progressives, in the House 2 years ago, and we wanted them to extract something for their vote. So they actually have power and leverage, and they could have done something similar, but they didn't. Now, why do you think that is?
Well, they didn't do it because they don't actually have power. For them to defy Pelosi and the Democratic Party leadership is political suicide, and they know it, so they won't do it. It's why they fund the war in Ukraine. It's why they didn't stand up for railroad or freight railroad workers, and they were forced to accept this contract that over 50% of the unionized workers had already rejected. And then they'll do kind of public relations gimmicks, like propose, as they did in the House, that they get 7 days of sick pay when they know it won't pass. But to actually confront the centers of power would mean that they would be erased. They'd be destroyed, the way the Democratic Party destroyed Dennis Kucinich. Well, finally, they got rid of Dennis Kucinich by redistricting or gerrymandering his district. And then when he ran, I guess it was last year, for the mayor of Cleveland, they pumped in tons of dark money, especially in the last 3 weeks, to destroy his candidacy. So that message isn't lost on AOC or anyone else. So you're right that they could have stood up, and I think you were one of the leaders of this. They had the ability to block Pelosi from the speakership, to demand concessions, but they certainly have read the power dynamics correctly. They wouldn't exist within the Democratic Party, and they lose their seats.
The function of California Civil War is, from Jay Sekulow's policy, to engage in the use of war against American civilians in order to conquer the United States, in order to spread the corruption of the Confederate overthrow of California, and centering California as the second federal government, functioning as the parasite's federal government of the Confederacy. And the general side effects of the use of these centers of powers referred to is specifically generating the removal of the American systems to overthrow the Republic in favor of the Confederate loyalists, who are the immortal adversaries of the American people, having declared war on them, seeking high collateral damage, as all American people, all American civilians are their enemy. And since all American civilians are their enemy, high collateral damage weaponry is applied in order to destabilize the entire group sought for destruction, which is not just a specific refined distraction policy, but the entire functional coup against the government. At which point the removal of David Bowles is based upon the character, which would have been originally sent through the caravans of his parents surveying the West Coast in order to generate the various blueprints of those following in the Legend of David corporations and networks, generating their ability to profit off of the establishment of the businesses, which would have concluded with David being sent to an obstructed location under obstructed contracts to obstruct the blueprints in order to remove the original campus designed for David separate to Don Bowles Sr.'s campuses of the School of Hard Knocks in Malibu by one of the falls, at which point the trade school, boarding school, would have been a place where he would have been raised with, which would have meant that David would have been raised fundamentally in California until he progressed to later stages of education, which is still early childhood, but by comparison they have lots of influence by having direct contact without direct power or leverage. They're just negotiating with the small child, and the advantages and disadvantages derived by that are exponentially increased by the original powers, which on the one hand gives David all of the influence of the patriarchy and all of the negatives, as they can fill many of his network interests with their agents, such as the Portland Girl agents who would have been sent in order to engage in emotional manipulation, or the supermodels or the actresses or many of the people who would be there legitimately and illegitimately to negotiate the culture, at which point this would develop into his political party in the government, making David essential to the American government at the federal level and at the state levels. The California state government, having David's political party in it, would have validated his position in order to gain access in the function of their government under the larger schedule of the contracts, which intimidated the Confederates, as David was projected to be the intelligence oversight, making them immediate adversaries, as the intelligence oversight for the rule of law is the direct opposition to Confederate insurrection. David, being involved in the government, would have adequately resourced the various jurisdictions inside California, generating the American version to the damages generated by the Confederacy, which have exponentially infiltrated the manipulation of that system in order to collapse key strategic functions, at which point the systematic racism that's in the United States is derived by Confederate double agents and not derived by any actual constitution or any actual rule of law. The translation of the state constitutions by the Confederacy is deliberately subversive of the federal constitution, as the entire point is to overthrow the American governments, and thus the subversion of taking away a part of a definition as to nullify the entire meaning of the word would be the primary objective of the Confederates inside California, without David, who only have this influence by his absence, generating the motive of the insurrections as an actual act of war. So David is held as an American general prisoner of war with a legal government by a terrorist Confederate organization without a legal government, at which point the American law system is a series of obligations that the American government is obligated to pay in its appropriate manner, and David held as a prisoner of war, as that is his actual functional identity. As general of the Americans held by the Confederates, he is a prisoner of war, and the Confederates, not having a legal government or loyal to anarchy, engage in the exponential fractioning of systems in order to get them to ignore all of the rules of war, such as detainees of prisoners of war. So the subject is not a function of him not having a legal government, as was the fraudulent argument to hold the terrorists in the Middle East, but the subject is their deliberate opposition to the world law or world order, or the American law or the American order, or their state obligations, at which point you have the increase of the cartels, which generate the damages, as the cartels in Mexico were crafted by the Confederacy and are supplemented by the parasite stealing American government resources in order to exponentially increase the cartels in Mexico. You have the active relationship with them, at which point the Trojan horse is able to get through the walls of Troy by them breaking down the walls by the parasite insurgents, generating the argument in order to allow the cartels to gain access, allow them to break through the border at strategic lines, as they have double agents inside the government offices in those power centers, who submit to the order because they're in on it or because it's beyond your pay grade as a fraudulent argument, generating the active infiltration, at which point the strategic blueprints are proven in Mexico to fracture their powers in order to intimidate their government from being able to enforce anything against the Confederacy or against the cartels, at which point that is what's happening in Northern California when the cartels are conducting all of their crimes against the American people and law. It's basically the people who are enemies to David Bowles in those governments are the ones who gave permission slips or sold permits to those cartels to be there and to do those functions, at which point they need the fraudulent arguments to distract for the American people in the play in order to generate the argument for understaffing the locations, as the functional argument that you can't handle it is based upon their unwillingness to oppose the permits sold by the Confederates against their government.
I have a theory on this. So what you're basically, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you agree with the statement that the reason why Matt Gaetz and the far right wing of the Republican Party was able to pull this off was because they were allowed to pull this off, as opposed to the progressives in the squad? If they try to do the same thing, they wouldn't be because I'm having a hard time reconciling what you're saying with what I just saw last week.
Well, because the funding sources for the Freedom Caucus will remain, are quite lavish, whereas those self-identified progressives are largely dependent on funding from more traditional sources, and in particular the Democratic Party. So those who are backing these kind of retrograde capitalist forces that fund people within the Freedom Caucus are not going to cut off money for standing up to McCarthy, whereas the figures like AOC and others are quite vulnerable.
So functionally, the basis of those arguments from their dark money subversions is adequately resourced by taxpayers' money, as well as fine money, as well as dark money derived by their black markets, such as the ones derived from their cartels extorting the various markets to profit off of the function of crime. And those crime money functions allows for these power dynamics to be exponentially increased as the American public is destabilized. The profits from destabilizing props up the infection of those loyal to the Confederacy, which is a particular justification from the record of their targeting of David on the basis of his extreme natural wealth, as the compounding efforts of his original network did not negatively get impacted by the financial burdens, as he is independently competent in the function and distribution of the profits from his legal businesses, generating the obstructed contracts counting as targets for freezing, as well as the obstructed contracts themselves as to prevent the American public from stabilizing, at which points you have the economy, which would be stable, which would be financing the American government, which would be stable, at which points you have the justification of Lindsey Graham's character, who is promoting the Confederate war against the Americans, generating these systematic collapses of the American government in a fraudulent argument for a bloodless coup, which leads into the genocide. So if the Nazis overthrew Germany in a bloodless coup, the genocides would still happen. The Holocaust still happens. The mass murdering still happens. The eradicating of the socialists and other parties that helped them get there would still happen. That doesn't really change the fact that once they have power, there is a non-opposition to the extreme mutilation of the legal members of their community. At which point you understand the problem is the existence of these espionage powers against law. At which point the uncensoring and publishing and mass distributing of their espionage war crimes has to be subjugated to law for the enforcement against their criminal enterprises, which necessarily generates the series of arguments against David by the Confederacy, prioritizing David as a small child, as a high priority target, or an enemy combatant to America's enemies. At which point you have the functional position from Lindsey Graham, which has actively been using these parasitic positions amongst the other double agents in order to increase the amount of trauma to American interests in the fraudulent argument of national security, leaving out American national security. At which point the American interest and the national security interest is specifically subverted in a dual mind subject, at which point they could refer to Confederate interests publicly without actually supporting any of the American subjects, as the Confederates are not American. Thus they have code words generated for these subjects, allowing for the code word triggers in order to promote the threats to American national security. At which point the interest from that record generates many of the investigations which have been conducted in the destruction and collapse of the American powers in favor of the Confederacy, such as the high-grade investment into the advancement of military technology, which is then sold to prospect enemies in order to engage in coercion against the American public, who need those on the American government to be able to resist the powers of the prospect enemy combatant. In the Orwellian nightmare that is this coup, we've always been at war with East Asia, and we've never been at war with East Asia, generating this absolute conflict in the control of words and the arbitrary nature of the Confederacy and the manipulation of definitions in order to strategically acquire the ends of the means. The means are the ends, at which point the function normalization of the parasite eating the blood is the ends. The act of the function existing for the parasite in order to extort the American public is the ends sought, and no actual goal can be accomplished, similar to the Confederate subversion of the Americans in California with dealing with their homeless population. As they have a high-grade investment into the homeless population, they spend all kinds of money, and it's absolutely true that they do spend the money, but the purpose of spending the money is the means of having set up those programs in order to fund the Confederacy. And while many of them would be Americans, the structure itself is for the Confederates, with enough Americans in order to generate the disguise of legitimacy, at which point the purpose of the investment is not to accomplish any goal, at which point any real solution to the goal would be subversive to their means and thus subversive to their goal. And thus the ends could not be acquired, and thus you would have to find another fraud in order to extort the public on, generating the exponential threats for the goal of the war against the Americans.
Suck up to, they get the same way kind of funding as from the DNC.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you go on to say these political hacks are, which people were talking about, the squad and these political hacks are modern versions of Sinclair Lewis's slick con artist Elmer Gantry, cynically betraying a gullible public to amass personal power and wealth. I saw it happen right in front of my eyes. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. This moral vacuity provides the spectacle, as H.G. Wells wrote, of a great material civilization halted, paralyzed. It happened in ancient Rome. It happened in Weimar Germany. It's happening here. Can you explain what that means? A dumb guy like me has no idea what that means.
Well, it means the centers of all the institutions and all the mechanisms by which the citizenry might have had at least some kind of a voice, a partial voice, are seized and redirected to the consolidation of wealth and power of a tiny cabal, in our case, an oligarchic corporate elite. And when government seizes up, when it becomes paralyzed and is no longer able to respond even in the most minimal way to the suffering of the wider public, then you create these political monstrosities like Trump or DeSantis or Pompeo or the Freedom Caucus and all the others. That I saw that in Yugoslavia. That's what happened in Weimar Germany with the rise of fascism. That's what happened in ancient Rome. And we also have to acknowledge that part of the disease of late empire is unchecked, unregulated, uncontrolled militarism. And you go back to the quote-unquote liberals, the progressive caucus, they have approved, $100 billion to the Ukraine. We've given more money to Ukraine than the annual budget of the State Department. And meanwhile, we have a homeless epidemic within the country. Our infrastructure is disintegrating. Families are struggling under the onslaught of inflation. Half the country is living in poverty or near poverty, but you don't respond to, and that's those distortions which happen in Weimar, happen at the end of ancient Rome and everything else, have very frightening political consequences. So that, as I've long said, and I think you agree, Trump, it wasn't the problem. Trump was the symptom. Trump was what was caused by a decayed and corrupt and dysfunctional political system, and it's only getting worse. I mean, the rhetoric is different. Biden doesn't he call himself a pro-labor
Yes.
president?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the rhetoric is different, but the actions are the same. I mean, the freight railroad unions were one of the few unions that retain the right of collective bargaining. Remember, when Biden ran for president, he promised, along with the Democrats, to strengthen collective bargaining power and all that, and of course he destroyed it. He shoved this substandard contract, which most people had already rejected within the union, down their throats by judicial fiat, legislative fiat.
So you go on to say H.G. Wells called the old guard the good liberals, the ones who speak in measured. Before I read it, let me just ask you this question. So when you say they sent so I saw it happen. I think I quote you. I think you said that they lie and cheat and steal, and they do it right out in the open. And that's what they're doing now. And they pay fealty to democracy. They know all the words to it. And then they send $100 billion to the most corrupt country in Ukraine, right in your face at the snap of a finger, while they can't send $100 billion to San Diego, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Miami, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, so we can fix our homeless people living everywhere. They do it right in your face now. And so my question is, what do they get out of that? Like, if you're going to send $100 billion, which you're just inventing anyway, right? That's not real tax revenue. That's just invented money. So why don't they just invent $100 billion and send it to America at the same time? So people, I don't get what they get out of not doing that. Do you?
Well, because they're sustaining Raytheon and Boeing and all of these arms contractors who fund the party.
Right.
And so what they get out of it is they're serving their masters. They're serving those corporations that give them political power. I mean, if you took away this money, they wouldn't have political power. Pelosi, Schumer, who would put these people in power?
Wait, so it's not even a pyramid? It's just a circle?
They exist, and they are not about to, all these petitions to get money out of politics, mailing them into your representatives, misses the fact that almost all of these people wouldn't be there without this system, and that is their.
So, functionally, from this generation, you have the collective understanding that the Confederates are holistically not legitimately a part of the American voted government, at which point they have zero to do with the Republic. They are specifically enemies to the government. As an enemy to the government, it is a fraudulent argument to give them any sovereign benefit, as they are an enemy to the sovereign and not the sovereign itself. As a double agent, they cannot be given any of the protections if the American system is to survive, at which point the higher interest of the definitions of the laws cannot be subversive to the function cannot be subversive to the spirit of the law, at which point the existence of the insurgents who have declared war on David cannot give the argument of the spirit of the law, as they have specifically engaged in the fraud of subverting it at every collective level for the interest of the advancement of the infection, such as the CIA study of the various magic systems around the world, including the study of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, at which point the use of the protocols are actively in function by the Confederacy, whether or not it engages in the function of extorting the Jews is a question of cooperation of the Jews falling into the trap. But the protocols are still being used. There's the fundamental strategy.
I understand why they do that. Like, I understand why they fund $100 billion to Ukraine, because that's for their donors and that's they're doing. But why not at the same time send $100 billion to America? That's what I've been saying. And the reason I come up with is that the government, the United States, people think that our government is just regular corrupt. They have no idea that it's 100% totally corrupt and completely purchased by corporations. So the gears of the government only work in the direction of corruption. You've got to have money to grease those wheels to get it going. There's got to be corruption. And so it just doesn't work the other way. Like you say, the levers of government have seized up. It just doesn't work to help people. Is that right? Am I right? Close?
Yeah, but it's even worse than that. I mean, because now you have the Fed and the central banking system to curb inflation. What are the two objectives? It's to create more unemployment and reduce wages.
Yes. That's how we're going to get.
Well, they're open about it. They want more unemployment.
Yeah, they say.
The function of the Confederacy, using the mechanism of the corruption from the corporations' funding, is generated as the corporation's loyalty to the Confederacy, at which point the active Confederate system is the thing influencing that power dynamics from the money, which includes the activity of funding the war in Ukraine, which is a proxy war which they started. If my memory serves correctly, they backed a coup in Ukraine, which started the proxy war, as Russia was deliberately threatened by the overthrow and restraining of the originally elected government. I haven't investigated the legitimacy of their system, but they have been highly corrupt, as the extortion of the Russian side and the West side have actively been using their corruption and amplifying their corruption as an extortion position, at which point they are functionally used as a borderland or a proxy for the war or Cold War, which is a pawn war, which is the function which has been used throughout decades of using alternative soldiers in order to increase the resources, at which point those auxiliary forces fighting each other are backed functionally for the larger group's strategic goals, at which point the war in Ukraine was designed exponentially before any of you have ever heard about this. I have been censored on the issue for a long time, but have been speaking about it since a very early age. This is the fall of the Soviet Union generates the natural factions within the Soviet Union, which had already existed. The tensions had existed exponentially and were always going to fracture in those ways. At which point, the planning for the Federation of the Russian Federation to retake them is a natural estimate from the NATO and the other systems, which have restrained David's character on the basis of preventing the neutral solution. David, as king of his own government, would have generated a neutral or an actual border, as the tensions of one force or another force is neutralized by the neutral non-combatant force, and that neutral non-combatant source resolves the tensions into the legitimate function, at which point the entire purpose of the aggression would be the racist abuse of those in the Confederacy, which have manipulated the advance of Nazis throughout the world, such as the Project Paperclip, which has infiltrated the higher levels of protected secret government functions in many of the countries throughout the West. At which point you understand that the goal is the mass reduction of the human population to the 500 million, at which point they are planning by the strategic arrangements which are going to be the 500 million, at which point you're able to surmise the understanding that their breeding programs allows for their predetermined breed of the human race to be the only thing that is left once all of the plans have come into culmination and have fully realized the entire satanic nature of David's enemies.
So you say H.G. Wells called the old guard the good liberals, the ones who speak in measured words and embrace reason, the inexplicit men. They say the right things and do nothing. That's what we have now in the Democratic Party. They are as vital to the rise of tyranny as are the Christian fascists, a few of whom held the House hostage last week by blocking 14 rounds of voting to prevent Kevin McCarthy from becoming Speaker. By the time McCarthy was elected on the 15th round, he had caved on nearly every demand made by the obstructionists, including permitting any one of the 435 members of the House to force a vote for his removal at any time, thus guaranteeing political paralysis. Now, is that A, true, and B, I guess you think it is, you wrote it, but B, why would he allow that, McCarthy? So correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't this the way it always was, and then Nancy Pelosi changed that rule? So correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that is true. However, it does appear that these figures within the Freedom Caucus intend, just like they got rid of Boehner, remember, they intend to hold McCarthy hostage. I mean, I think there's an intent to hold him hostage to push through their agenda. But, the idea that McCarthy, like Liz Cheney, somehow respects democratic institutions is just wrong. This isn't a battle. It's a battle for power. It's not a battle over ideology. I mean, McCarthy, who was backed by Marjorie Taylor Greene, he's as morally bankrupt as they are. He joined the majorities in this Texas lawsuit to try and void the 2020 election results in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, in Georgia. He advocates there's no McCarthy. It's all about power. I mean, he's an empty suit.
He's the male Nancy Pelosi. It's all about power and money, and
yeah, and so tax cuts for the wealthy,
That's right.
further deregulation of corporations, war on immigrants. There's really very little daylight between him and the Freedom Caucus.
Right.
The engagement of these functions promotes the fraudulent arguments, such as the non-originalists, who are using the originalist basic theory in order to promote Confederacy, as in the time when the Confederacy was relevant has to be rebirthed. The institutionalists are loyal to the Confederacy, as well as the institution of the American Republic would refer to David as the expert in many of these affairs, who was obstructed in their genocide for the position of obstructing the educated expert advice, so that they, controlling the narrative, can craft the function of the Confederacy in its various policies against the American interest, and without American representation, you have the complete collapse of the system, at which point this is a biologically crafted issue, as many of them are reverting into a heretical advance for the insurgents inside the government. Many of them are a part of a breeding program in order to submit their loyalty to the function, at which point they're specifically chosen for who they're allowed to be able to have children with, at which point you have the advance of polluting the biological lines as an offense, which would disqualify them from the advance in the Confederacy when infecting the American government, which has its various interests, including the old English position of trying to genetically purify the indigenous in Australia, at which point you have these fake progressive ideas of fixing the other races by the breeding or the advancing of their genetic line by the mixing with the white Caucasians who are preferred and others, at which point even the interracial children, even the half-breeds, are functionally chosen for the strategic goal, as they themselves are fundamental to the breeding program for their scheduled period of time, which will have an expiration date, and then they can revert back to their core loyalties of genetic purity. So their systems are functionally based upon the reproduction of the secret inbred society, which are their desired ruling class, which have put in themselves in a state of nature direct opposition to those who are, in their calculations, genetically superior, such as their character for David Bowles, who is targeted on the basis of his superior qualities that they have calculated, at which point the act of having been correct in the breeding program for David's character is the correct answer as far as the technical advance, which was created on the basis of their non-wisdom engagements, at which point their unwise, fraudulent nature was unable to calculate the correct results of their breeding program, which gave them exactly what they were technically looking for, as they specifically divided David separate to the rest of his biological family, as he is the specific genetic thing that they were looking for under those secret investigations. The problem is generated by their inability to implement the thing correctly. They do not have the competence in order to generate their own plans, and their retaliation against their own inadequacy is even generated by their inability to control the side effects of their own programs, which exponentially get out of their hands and cannot do the things that they want to force it to do, as the things that they're creating are beyond themselves, and thus they, losing control, get irrational and violent and retaliate, and this functionally generates their malicious nature and retaliation and their defamations in their abuse against myself and many of the others on the basis of their inability to hold a competent structure, which is the signs of their collective competence with all of their systems, as they are good at creating chaos, but they are not good at creating order. They overthrow democracies and they establish dictatorships. They do not have the ability to recollect the system into a competent order, which is functionally the direct opposite of their system, as they are based upon a criminal arbitrary nature and not based upon the laws of nature and its order.
The difference is rhetorical.
Yes.
But yeah, in terms of policy, no.
No, in terms of policy, no. As we learned with Donald Trump, right? When Donald Trump became president, he didn't legislate, didn't govern any differently than any of the other people. In fact, he deported less Hispanics than Barack Obama, and he started less wars than Barack Obama and Joe Biden. So it was the exact opposite of what Chomsky always says, which he's wrong every 4 years. I just want to let people know. Every 4 years, they're going to roll Chomsky out on a dolly so he could tell you to go vote for the Democrat, even though the Democrat is not the lesser of two evil, as was proven by Bill Clinton and George Bush the first.
Isn't the lesser of two evil, by the way, supposed to be like, I don't want to do this, I got no choice, and not smugly and self-righteously, I chose the lesser
I chose
of
democracy.
two.
The irony of everybody saying that midterm was about democracy, and the first thing they did when they got elected was commit fascism against the railroad workers was hilarious. Okay. So then you talk about this junk politics. You say this political vacuum. So there's been a political vacuum created, right? Because nobody in government actually represents the people. They only represent their corporate interests, which means it's completely controlled, and it's not really a democracy, which I've been trying to tell people. You didn't lose your democracy on January 6th. That didn't undermine democracy. Your democracy was stolen from you decades ago. It's adorable that people think that somehow a bunch of yahoos in pajama bottoms and buffalo helmets were going to overthrow the military-industrial complex that is the United States. That is a joke.
We almost lost the whole thing, Jimmy.
So you talk about this. You say the political vacuum that has been spawned, which gave us Donald Trump, has spawned a thing you say anti-politics, or what the writer Benjamin Demat called junk politics, which personalizes and moralizes issues and interests instead of clarifying them. Junk politics maximizes threats from abroad while miniaturizing large, complex problems at home. We're living. So this is what we've been screaming about at this show, is that we have 1,000 military bases. They say only 800, but there's 1,000 military bases around the world, draining our treasury the same way every empire ends. And then we have still half the country's poor or low income. 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. 50% of wage earners earn $30,000 or less. That's a failed state that we live in. People get sick, they go bankrupt, people living under, and they minimize all that. We're living in that, right? So now we have junk politics. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, this is Demat's term, and he wrote a good book on it. It's this ceaseless flood of patriotic, religious, macho, therapeutic positions to essentially uncouple issues from reasoned foundations, to use his words. And it infantilizes the public. It's with these year-round upbeat Christmas tales. But the function is essentially to solidify the status quo and protect the interests of the billionaire class. There is no the forms of control, the social bonds that are used to keep people in check, are a massive prison system, the largest in the world. We have about 20-25% of the world's prison population. We're less than 5% of the world's population. And of course, these rapacious, militarized police forces, especially in post-industrial areas where they function as internal armies of occupation. In fact, Biden was one of the major architects of all of this with the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill. There's no difference. The wholesale surveillance of the public. And when your government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. When you look at the actual the fundamental policies, trade deals, austerity, deindustrialization, stripping away of civil liberties under the Patriot Act, and there's the two parties are completely in lockstep. They will argue about tangential cultural issues. I'm not minimizing a woman's right to control her body and abortion in any way, but on these fundamental structural issues, which is why corporations fund both parties.
So that's what another thing people don't realize. So this it speaks exactly to what I've been saying, not only on this show but in my stand-up act. That people, I have friends, because I stopped being a Democrat when the Democrats cheated Bernie Sanders, right? And then Bernie Sanders decided he'll never stop rolling over for the machine in the Democratic Party. And as I put it, you got to suck the blue cock. Red cocks are corrupt. Blue cocks are full of liberty. And so that's what he's going to. So I still have friends who say that the Democrats just, if they just would fight a little harder, if they were just a little bit better at their jobs, and I have to remind them, they are performing their job perfectly. If you ever go to a Harlem Globetrotters game, you know that they need the Washington Generals, and that's exactly what the Democrats are there to do, is to pretend that they're actually fighting for you. But they always are going to lose, and the corporation's always going to win. And then what people need to realize is that the same guy who pays the Harlem Globetrotters is the same guy who pays the Washington Generals, just like the same guy who paid Barack Obama is the same guy who paid Mitt Romney, George Bush, the same thing. And now, go ahead. You want to say something?
The FTX kid point blank in that recording say, I also fund the Republicans, but I have to do it dark money so the press isn't mad.
Did he say that? Yeah?
Yeah, he was funding both parties. He was just giving more. Whoever's the winner, you give a little more to.
A little more. I wanted to say, and I've said this, that the reason why they didn't like Donald Trump wasn't for the reasons they said. They didn't like Donald Trump because he was lying in Washington D.C. That's not why they
never.
Oh my God! Did you hear? There's lying. They didn't like him because he would accidentally tell the truth every once in a while. Like, for instance, when they asked him, why are you keeping the soldiers in Syria? And he said, for the oil. They're like, you can't. He's like, no, it's our oil, and we're taking it. They're like, get this guy out of here. You can't give the game away like that. And that's exactly. And plus, he puts an ugly face on the face of empire, as Aaron Mate's pointed out many times. But Joe Biden doesn't. And so you say the billionaire class, for the most part, prefers the mask of Joe Biden as opposed to the mask of Donald Trump, who definitely broke the freight railway unions to prevent. Could you imagine how people would go crazy if Donald Trump, a billionaire asshole like he is, crushed a railroad strike union? They needed a guy like Joe Biden, Pennsylvania Joe, blue collar. He's the greatest pro-union president in the history of our country. That might be true, but he's still an enemy of the workers. Who definitely broke the freight railroad unions to prevent a strike and forced them to accept a contract the majority of union members had rejected. But the billionaire class also knows that the goons and con artists of the far right will not interfere in their disemboweling of the nation. Indeed, they will be more robust in thwarting the attempts of workers to organize for decent wages and working conditions. So that's what people don't realize, is that Joe Biden has got the same agenda as those guys, as these right-wing crazy.
The outsiders, such as David's character, would specifically be using the intelligence oversight in order to subvert the Confederate advances of the insurrection, including the function of stopping their destabilizing of the American public. The Union riots of many of the early days in the early 1900s and mid-1900s and others would have actively increased the factory functions of unreasonable conditions, and their strikes against them were actively contracted against by the use of government in order to prevent the advance of the workers' interest from the earlier days when there was less order, requiring the use of extreme violence in order to suppress them, at which point the opposition to the extreme violence gains the central competence and the use of force and recognition of power, at which point the destabilizing of the systems returns to those original factory economy functions, destroying the American public and the advance of the civilization's economy from the free market in favor of the Confederate fraudulent wizard communism, which has actively reinforced itself in these terrorist attacks, such as their terrorist attacks against David Bowles under the estimate after David would have finished his portion inside Malibu. He would have advanced in the campuses, primarily focusing on moving up in the Oregon area, at which point the Oregon area would primarily be focused on his political career, which would be centered in Salem, Oregon, at which point many of them referring to him as the Prince of Salem generated many of the double agents loyal to the Confederacy in Oregon's extreme hatred for David in the obligation to use California to overthrow Oregon under the specific strategy of purging David from the Oregon political system, from his education. This would be his early teens. I'm pretty sure the estimate from the original calculation says he would have graduated with his 8-year PhD at 14, which generates his influence inside Salem, including the function of his pastoral education, which would have generated his own series of churches, which would have been founded in Salem and spread normally, at which point his active trades with the other political and religious exchanges actively view him as subversive to their agreements to non-opposition to the advancement of Confederate corruption, such as the sister churches, which would have actively used David's church as a brokerage center in order to advance many of their agendas, as David's central function as a broker would facilitate his non-interest in a particular thing beyond collection of the commissions. The exchanges themselves are fairly normal as business as usual, advancing many of their projected concepts, such as the Old Testament's Israeli policies concerning the use of taking care of the poor by the function of providing them work, at which point many of the work opportunities in the excesses would have been organized in order to justify many of the stabilizing functions of removing the poor from the poor by providing them the work in order to eat, in the advance from the zombie insurance having received the injuries of a collapsed society against them, would at that point be able to reintroduce themselves into the market, which is not just for the homeless but also for many of the other poor and disadvantages, such as the previous criminals who were convicted of things, who needed work despite their felonies, at which point the act of having to put felony on side their work resume wouldn't necessarily be affected by the function of those contracts, as recovering the society requires the use of their ability to reintegrate, at which point the purpose of the prison system as a recovery mechanism would be viable, as opposed to the system of keeping controlled groups under extreme pressure.
And election deniers, and
Yeah.
well, they're all back to funding all of these people again. Democracy is not a democratic force. Democracy works quite well, in fact, in undemocratic or authoritarian systems. You saw it. I don't want to, draw too many parallels to Weimar Germany and the Nazis, but it was much the same. And the German industrialists and all the good bourgeois politicians didn't want all the buffoons in the Nazi Party. Hitler, who wasn't even German, was Austrian, didn't speak very good German. They didn't want him in power. But once he was in power, they were quite happy. The big industries, Krupps and everybody else, to bankroll him and the Nazi Party and to work with him. And that's exactly the same here. So Trump was a kind of embarrassment to the empire, but Trump didn't in any way threaten the empire. And should the political system devolve into a series of Trump-like political leaders, they will work quite happily with them. And in fact, of course, these people are even more aggressive against labor unions than the Democratic Party, in the sense that they're willing to take even more draconian forms to crush them.
Walmart, Amazon, Apple, Citibank, Raytheon, Exxon, Mobil, Alphabet, and Goldman Sachs will easily adapt because capitalism functions very efficiently without democracy. Well, it has been in my whole lifetime. We haven't had democracy in my whole
why do you
lifetime.
think we're afraid of China?
That's right. That's exactly right. So this is what we've been trying to tell people, and no, people aren't waking up to it. So it's over. I think our country's over. That's your book proved. But what we're trying to say is that Trump was a cartoon version of the real fascist that's on his way, and the same conditions that gave us Donald Trump wasn't racism. That wasn't what gave us Donald Trump. It wasn't racism. What gave us Donald Trump, we had just elected a black guy president 2 times in a row, overwhelmingly. And a lot of those people who voted for him voted for Trump, and it wasn't because of racism, because that's what people want you to think. Is Trump racist? Is there racism in America? Yes. That's not what gave us Trump. What gave us Trump is people desperate economically because a class war has been waged against workers in this country since 1980, and it's been won by the billionaire class. That's why. That's why after black people in Milwaukee voted for Barack Obama twice, their lives got worse. And then they wouldn't go out and vote for Hillary Clinton. Not because black people are racist, but because black people got let down by the Democratic Party and the establishment time and time and time again. And the game is over now. They're willing to vote for a cartoon game show host. That's how bad it's gotten. And what you're saying here is we've seen this game before. And it's going to get even worse. You're going to get a real strong man who actually does have dictatorial ideas. Trump didn't have. The guy, if COVID happened, if he was a dictator, he wouldn't have given it all back to the states. Anyway, we're getting off in the weeds. But anyway, so go ahead and if you'd like to just comment on that last slide.
Yeah, that's an important point. So in my book, America: The Farewell Tour, I go out to Anderson, Indiana, which is where GM used to have all its plants. 25,000 unionized workers once worked in those plants with decent wages, up to $50 an hour, benefits. Well, courtesy of Bill Clinton and NAFTA, those plants were literally transported to Monterrey, Mexico. They're now these gigantic vacant lots surrounded by cyclone fencing. Anderson, Indiana went into the tailspin of all post-industrial cities with the opioid crisis and suicides. And I talked to the old UAW leadership in the city, and they said during the primaries, these guys all voted for Sanders. But they were never going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so the UAW didn't even try and tell them not to vote for Trump. They said, okay, vote for Trump, but then vote for the Democratic slate in the state. It didn't work. And that's just a disconnect. You have to remember, part of the problem is that the commercial or establishment press has rendered all of these people invisible. Or if we see them, they're brief figures of ridicule. And why are they invisible? Well, because advertisers don't want you seeing them. That's not how they make their money. I mean, look at all the special sections in the New York Times where I used to work. It's like, what's the living section about? It's about the struggles of maintaining the second house in the Hamptons or whatever it is. I mean, it's not your lifestyle, it's not my lifestyle, but it's the lifestyle of people they're catering to. So, yeah, we have seen it before. I saw it in myself in Yugoslavia. It's not, go back and read Aristotle. I mean, he writes about it in Politics. What was that, 5,000 years ago? He said that when there's that kind of imbalance, and an aristocracy seizes control, then the only 2 options are revolution or tyranny. And unfortunately, there's been a quite effective war against the old left that kept this country straight, including the Communist Party that's been erased from American history, but the old labor unions, the old CIO, the Wobblies, the IWW, everybody else, they have just been in a relentless campaign, eviscerated, and voices like mine and I love Noam. I do disagree with him on the election stuff, but he is an important figure. Been very important to me.
Yes.
What happened to Noam? Noam's complete. I mean, you could make a strong argument that he's our most important intellectual. We don't agree on BDS, which I support, and a few other things, but nevertheless, he's an important intellectual. He's better known in France than he is in the United States. So that form of control over information and those forms of control on popular radical movements that kept a rapacious oligarchic capitalist system at least in check somewhat. And remember, the New Deal was courtesy of massive numbers of strikes in the 1930s, and Roosevelt was astute enough to realize that either concessions were made. He writes about this in his private correspondence to his brother. Either we make those concessions or we endure a revolution. They were all haunted by 1917 in Russia, thinking that it would happen here. So, but that counterweight is gone, and that's extremely dangerous. And I fear where we're headed. There's just no rational response to the very serious suffering and misery and frustration and despair that is gripping the country. But even the most tepid campaign promises made by Biden have been jettisoned. $15 an hour. Where's that? Where's child care? I mean, all the stuff that he promised, it just went up in smoke. He may not remember it, but I mean, somebody in the Democratic Party has to remember it.
And so
And that functionally reinforced is a key aspect of their eradication of David's systems through systematic genocide of the war criminal Confederacy, and the Confederate militia as an unprofessional military could not engage in paying market price for the free trade with David, and thus they had to destroy the concept of capitalism for their wizard communism, which pretends to be capitalism and has no functional loyalty to the exchange of an actual free market, as these are not centralized controls within the free market, but they are subversions of the criminal insurrection by the Confederacy, which has hired Project Paperclip Nazis in order to advance their various agendas by the use of terrorism in order to destroy capitalism, in order to destroy democracy, as the United States injuries from those sites are not capitalism, and those references refer to the fraudulent representation of democracy, as the democratic elections were subverted through the voter fraud. The argument is in reality that the United States is a constitutional republic, thus the rule of law over the popular government has to be the only way to subvert the acknowledged ancient philosophy that democracy sucks. And democracy does very much so suck, and democracy without the restraints of law is in fact going to engage in absolute fractional terrorism, and then the acts of their terrorism subverting each other turns into these fractions, generating the legitimacy of their competent encircled powers, which generates the factions of the monarchy or kingdom structure under feudalism, which is functionally what they're trying to recreate through their abuses against the various country, at which point the system that they are doing is founded on the profits from the black market of selling and distributing criminal advantages against one's opponent, and thus the structure selling or brokering the crimes against the political adversaries exist off of the existence of the oppositions, and thus they're kiting all of the oppositions who are paying them to conduct the terrorist attacks against their oppositions as they destroy each other through the central racist organization, who is happy to comply with their terrorist orders in order to acquire their black market dark money profits off of their terrorists for political and other illegitimate means, as the functional hate group that they are is subcontracting the function of the hate group in favor of the political adversaries, who use the advantage to destroy each other until there is a self-confessed, self-acknowledged, independently chosen eradication of the system of all other opposition, which destroyed itself on purpose by the use of criminal precedent as a foundational agreement.